Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Asaf Ramarowski, the Executive Director of SPME and ASMIA, and it is my pleasure to once again welcome you to our webinar series. This afternoon, we got the privilege and opportunity to talk to our friend Carrie Nelson, who is a prolific scholar and champion of the cause of a lot of the issues that we've been tackling for years. Everything that Carrie has been writing is highly recommended to all of you to read. Carrie's two latest books. One of them, which has received the Asmia Bernard Lewis Prize, is entitled Hate Speech and Academic Freedom, the Anti-Semitic Assault on Basic Principles. And of late, he has published another great monograph called Madness, What Happened to the Universities. So there's a lot to discuss within the space that we all tackle. Carrie has been really one of the more erudite experts on tackling the question of academic freedom and anti-Semitism. There are a lot of examples to talk about of late regarding the AAUP, and Carrie will hopefully give us his insight, I'm sure he will, about a lot of these issues as we tackle them and going forward, especially also with the new administration, and tackle some of what's been happening historically. Format-wise, there's a few housekeeping issues. Carrie will talk for about a half hour or so, and then we will go into Q&A. Q&A will be done via the chat. All you have to do is type in your questions, and we will do our best to respond in a timely fashion. If we don't get to your questions this afternoon, we promise to respond after the webinar. So really, Carrie, without further ado, thank you once again for joining us, and the virtual floor is now yours.
Thanks so much, Asaf. It's always great to talk with you, and always great to have a chance again to reach out to SPME's audience, large audience. That we set up this particular event because just last month I brought out this little book called Mindless, What Happened to the University, which was the result of a challenge from the Jewish Quarterly, which issues these issues. Each of its issues 4 times a year is a little paperback book with a spine and everything, and they are reviewed as books, and they're available on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and other online retailers. And every subscriber to the Jewish Quarterly gets one as part of the subscription. So I recommend subscribing. The next issue is going to be Anthony Kirsch reviewing the concept of Zionism and asking what's happening, Adam Kirsch, sorry, on Zionism, which will be another little book. So hopefully a series of very timely publications. This book was an effort, a challenge from the Jewish Quarterly to write absolutely not for a purely academic audience, but for a general educated audience. And I write often for academics. I've done op-eds and other things for broad audiences, but really trying to do that for a whole book was a challenge that I had to work rather hard at, and hope I had some success at it. It's a book that has a thesis, and the thesis is that what I regard as the general politicization of universities, and in fact, in some ways, the decay and the decline of the higher education mission, has anti-Zionism at its core. In other words, I argue that anti-Zionism is a kind of gateway drug to polarization, to the rejection of dialogue and discussion, to the rejection of truth. Once you don't care what the truth is about Israel, it doesn't work that you remain a dedicatee of the truth in other domains. No, you become susceptible to ideology. You become susceptible to the conclusion that you know what's true in absolute terms. You're no longer interested in a conversation, and it has So anti-Zionism has had a general destructive impact on higher education. So I don't think that thesis has really been stated anywhere else that I know, though, of course, I may have missed it. So that's the first thing the book really tries to do, is to set out that general claim that anti-Zionism is not just hurting Jews and Jewish students and Jewish faculty, it's hurting everything about higher education. One of the things I do is talk about the encampments from spring 2024 as completely exemplifying that patterns. In many previous moments of anti-Israel demonstration, debate, and activism, you encountered specific demands of the Jewish state, that they should do this, that they should change their policy on that. And that's been a feature, a debatable feature, but a feature nonetheless of anti-Zionist activism, both on and off campus, for decades. In the spring of 2024, on campuses, and that built since 10/7. It was an after effect of 10/7, an after effect which took about 23 seconds to get into place, but it developed over the next 9 months until we got to the spring of 2024. At that point, you didn't encounter requests for Israel to change its policies. You didn't hear really much in the way of demands for a two-state solution. You hardly heard a word about that from the encampment activists. You didn't even hear much in the way of demands for the one-state solution, which I consider to be a miasma and a disaster, but you didn't even hear that disastrous demand. What you began to hear from the encampments and what you had heard from public demonstrations for months previous was, you've got to get rid of the Jewish state. So the left on campus, and indeed in cities around the world, coalesced around a much more unforgiving conviction than we had faced before, a conviction that Israel had to go. Now, it was built into comparisons, say the invidious comparisons between Israel and Nazi Germany. Those basically were demands that Israel couldn't be reformed. There were no policies to be corrected or updated. It was a monstrous regime like the Nazis, and you had to get rid of it. So that tendency had been at work for years, but it really coalesced after 10/7 and then manifested itself most dramatically in the campus encampments. And you can look at the book to get this in more detail, but I think many people are unaware of just how worldwide those encampments were. The first one was at Columbia University, and Columbia set the pattern for around 150 encampments across the United States, including one at the University of Illinois on my own campus. We had 50 tents, and we had several hundred students demonstrating. Um, and the pattern included one, setting up the encampment in the night so that it couldn't be, so that the staff and the grounds personnel wouldn't be aware of it. You could get the thing all set up before daylight. You began chanting anti-Israel slogans as the sun rose. You made demands of the university. You considered occupying a university building, as Columbia demonstrators did. And you also thought, well, as part of this perfect political process, we ought to keep these damn Zionists off campus. So on campus after campus in the United States, Jewish students, especially visibly Jewish students, wearing a Star of David, wearing a kippah, doing something that made them evidently Jewish, were blocked from access to campus spaces. The campus squad, the library, classrooms uh, were blocked in some cases. In other cases, they were interrupted and overwhelmed by chanting. The chants went on well after sunset. Columbia set these patterns, but then they were duplicated, very quickly across the United States. Within 7 or 8 days, there were many encampments in the United States. And then they went worldwide. I mean, I think there are many American students and faculty are not aware that there were 9 encampments in Japan. There were 11 encampments in Australia. There are about 30 or more in the British Isles. Um, Elsewhere, Brazil had one, Kuwait had one, Jordan had one. It began in late April in the United States. By early May, it had spread across the world. Of course, it wouldn't have been possible without social media. So the Columbia pattern was distributed worldwide. Chants were distributed worldwide and translated into local languages. All of that was shared online, and that made possible what, in fact, was the most rapid politicization of universities in our lifetime. I'm still astonished by it. I'm still astonished by the internationalization of that movement before you could hardly take a breath. And it was preceded by the politicization of the campuses that took place immediately after 10/7 itself. And that, for me, includes, amongst other things, the formation in October and November of 2023 of Faculty for Justice in Palestine, a particularly venomous anti-Zionist enterprise that gave faculty members who hate Israel and hate Jews a sense of solidarity, if you will, murderous anti-Jewish solidarity. It's my conviction and the conviction of some of my friends that the single worst manifesto that Faculty for Justice in Palestine produced was from my own campus here at UIUC. And we analyzed that. We have a piece in Fathom. Brett Kaufman and I did a piece analyzing that manifesto, an astonishing document. One of its recommendations takes the BDS anti-normalization campaign, which has been growing for years, and adds some elements to it. For example, this FJP manifesto, which has been adopted elsewhere, of course, says if you're a faculty member and you take morality seriously, if you're asked to serve on a faculty committee, or if you are assigned to serve on a faculty committee, because some of us get told you're doing it, right? We're not always sweetly asked. They say, we need your help on this. This is your job. And it's part of your job. If you're assigned to a faculty committee as a faculty member, and you discover that lo and behold, there's a Zionist on that committee, just tell the administration and your department head, you'll be damned if you'll serve on that committee. You'll be damned if you'll sit at a table with a Zionist. You'll be damned if you'll drink a cup of coffee in the presence of a Zionist. You refuse to serve. Well, I'd like to think that if you're up for tenure and you have a history of behaving that way, maybe they'll tell you to do something else with your life. So that politicization of the faculty, over 100 chapters, FJP chapters were created, that preceded spring 2024. So there was a build up to it. And of course, we learned several things rather rapidly after the 10/7 attack. Israelis were stunned by their own failure to anticipate what Hamas was capable of, by their failure to recognized the planning that Hamas was doing and taking it seriously. We in the US had almost a kind of similar failure of imagination. We failed to see what the depth of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel hatred was on our own campus. As you know, I'm sure you've read about the statement issued within hours of knowledge of the 10/7 attacks by 30 student groups at Harvard, declaring that Israel was 100% responsible for the 10/7 attacks. Hamas wasn't responsible. Those poor terrorists in Gaza just did what any reasonable terrorists would do and went out to slaughter men, women, and children in the Gaza envelope. All Israel's fault. And then that began to be adopted over and over again throughout the communities here and worldwide. It is, I think, inarguable that that immediate reaction of blaming Israel in the face of brutal, intimate, homicidal attacks in tiny villages, kibbutzim, public spaces in the Gaza envelope. It didn't come from nowhere. It couldn't arise out of nothing. It had to be there as a reservoir of hatred. I think Israel underestimated the level of hatred on Hamas's part, and we underestimated the level of anti-Jewish hatred in our own communities. It didn't arise out of nothing. You can't explain it any other way. And of course, we saw numerous faculty members, led in some ways by Joseph Massad at Columbia, expressing ecstasy at the attacks. And over the next weeks and months, other faculty members at other schools picked up that sentiment. And that helped define the attitude of the demonstrators on those fateful weeks in the spring. Reasoning, debate, discussion was replaced by slogans and chants. And we had slogans and chants in political demonstrations for years. As a student, my first opportunity to chant LBJ, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? That was in a Vietnam demonstration, anti-war demonstration in Columbus, Ohio in 1965, quite a few years ago. And I loved doing it. And then I was wrestled to the ground by a Secret Service agent because I was only about 20 feet from Lyndon Johnson, along with a dozen of my compatriots. And he whispered in my ear, "I'd like to get you behind bars and beat the SHIT out of you." So I learned something about chants, and I learned something about demonstrations from an early age. But we also did teach-ins. We did debates. We did a lot of reflection, and we struggled to find solutions. We struggled to find answers because we were at a college and we believed that education was part of our mission as anti-war activists. But the encampments in spring 2024 were all based on the principle that we already have the answers. There are no questions to be asked. There are no uncertainties to be confronted. There is simply a truth of Israel's absolute evil. That's where we begin. That's the conclusion we share. And that's, I think, why we have faced as much of a crisis on campus as we have since then. So let's take another example of ways in which anti-Zionism has spread and corrupted the campus more broadly. And the most obvious example is the move to cancel Zionist speakers and to cancel all Israeli speakers. An Israeli can come to talk about, uh, drip agriculture, which is a wonderful thing to see, and which the rest of the Mideast badly needs if it's going to feed itself or have any chances of feeding itself. But you come to a campus and you talk about drip agriculture, and student activists don't want to let you do it because you're an Israeli Jew and they don't want to hear you talking on anything. Well, the history of such cancellations has always included not just Israel-related speakers, but it's included attempts to shut down speakers taking a whole range of political positions that some particular constituency disapproves of. But the overwhelming majority of those cancellations have been focused on Jews and Israel. That's been the core of the efforts to cancel speeches. That core has spread. And of course, we've seen a huge uptick in the past couple of years of demands to cancel speakers in any way connected to Israel. And that's continued to spread to other kinds of political intolerance. And that's a way in which anti-Zionism, when you indulge yourself in it in a university, it begins to corrupt other things that the university does. And of course, some active anti-Zionists on campuses have played a real role in trying to get other speeches canceled. It's none other than our dear friend Judy Butler, who was at the core of the effort to cancel Milos Yiannopoulos' talk at Berkeley. Now, he's a despicable guy. I mean, he's a he's an entrepreneur for radical, prejudicial, biased positions across a whole range of issues. So she took the position, along with some other faculty members, that the Berkeley community needs to be protected from Milos's ideas. Now, the chance that the Berkeley community was going to be persuaded by his anti-gay passions, for example, I think are pretty much exactly nil. They didn't need to be protected. But there she was, an anti-Zionist willing to apply the same restrictive principles to a talk that had nothing to do with Israel or Zionism. And so those kinds of biases spread. That's a good, clear example. I expect to see more demands with that specific rhetoric, that students, faculty, and staff needed to be protected from Zionism, right? It's a danger to them. It's our job as moral witnesses to try to keep our community from the harm that a Zionist speaker could do, or the harm that an Israeli biologist could do by talking about a subject having nothing much to do with Zionism. We're going to see more of that. We're going to see more efforts to claim, and I think this is just emerging over the last year or so, that any attempt to critique radical anti-Zionist, quote, scholarship, pseudo-scholarship, constitutes an assault on academic freedom. That's nonsense, of course. It's a responsibility of academic freedom to call into question, analyze, and debunk claims made by other faculty members that are incorrect, false, based on misinformation, based on the desire to deceive. Academic freedom includes that responsibility. It includes the responsibility to police the writings of your colleagues and praise them or criticize them substantively as they require. You're going to see complaints during tenure evaluations that criticism of, quote, anti-Zionist, quote, scholarship is a violation of that person's freedoms. So we're going to have to try to mount more and more defenses against this kind of corruption of what the academy is all about. There's really no, our job is getting harder. Our job is getting more difficult. Um, and I try to lay some of that out in the book. I can't cover in that book. I can't cover it all here, but you can get a sense of what I'm trying to do. In just the few minutes that are left, I'd like to make a couple of comments about other issues. I called this talk Scholasticism versus indoctrination because of the resolution that have come up at several academic organizations, including the American Historical Association, asking for faculty members and graduate students to vote in condemnation of, quote, scholasticide, which is theoretically the deliberate attempt to destroy academic institutions in Gaza, universities. So a few years ago, I wrote a book called Not in Kansas Anymore, Academic Freedom in Palestinian Universities. And I reviewed the status of academic freedom both on the West Bank and on Gaza. And the conclusion, to put it in a phrase, is there isn't much of it on the West Bank, and there is none of it in Gaza. The Islamic University of Gaza, the single most well-known institution, the institution that trains Hamas leaders, has as its official public stand in print that every course on every subject at the Islamic University is taught not from an Islamic perspective, but from an Islamist perspective. In other words, every course, not just literature, easy to figure how they're going to do that, but chemistry, accounting, every single course embodies hatred of Israel, hatred of Zionism, and that's its guiding principle. That may be the worst thing about Gaza's universities. But of course, they came under sustained bombing in 2014 for the first time. Why? Well, a certain amount of university architecture has adopted quite widespread pattern worldwide. You build buildings around a central quad. You have an open space where students can gather, that events can be held. University of Virginia started that in the United States, but it's all around the world. A little different in Gaza because they realize that those open spaces are terrific launching pads for rockets. Gives you a nice open space, gives you, access to the sky. And so Israel was bombing them because they were launching rockets from them. They were also sites of weapons. They were weapons depots. There have been several cases when the universities in Gaza disagreed about some issue or other, and that resulted in armed conflict between the universities. People killed one another from the campuses. Islamic University of Gaza also did a lot of weapons developments for Gaza, for Hamas. And that's another reason why it's a valid military target. You launch rockets from there, you develop weapons from there. Well, I don't have time to go through it all, but there is this book you can look at. And that's why I called the book Not in Kansas Anymore. Americans are naive enough so that if you use the word university, they think, oh, those things in Gaza are just like the ones we have here. They're universities. It's terrible to see them destroyed. I'm sorry. It'd be better if they rebuild them from the ground up with different faculty and staff, and they rebuild them in the absence of Hamas having any military or political power. Islamist universities built on hate do not benefit students, faculty, or the world. So, Scholasticide, well, there ain't much scholas there. They're quite capable of training an accountant. They're quite capable of training people for those kinds of roles, but they're also indoctrination centers. In much the same way, unfortunately, that some of our departments on American campuses, including the Middle East program at Columbia, obviously, have become indoctrination centers. Um, so there's a parallel as well between, in this case, between Gaza and the US, a choice between indoctrination or education. Gaza made that choice, and the US is in the process of making it, and it's making the wrong choice, at least for certain degraded disciplines that are defining the public face of the university. And I think we have to face the fact that those corrupted disciplines are representing the university to the public as a whole. And higher education cannot sustain its credibility if those corrupted, politicized disciplines, those indoctrination centers on campus, are left as they are. They have to be mothballed, they have to be put into receivership, and otherwise, the university will continue a general decline. Universities as a whole have the responsibility to deal with their degraded academic disciplines. So that's my half hour. I have the resources to go on quite a bit more, but I know that uh, uh, Asaf would like to give people a chance to ask questions.
Great. Thank you, Carrie. That was wonderful. And obviously there is a lot to think about. And, as always, a an erudite analysis of a lot of the issues that we're facing today. I have a bunch of questions. I know we have also a bunch of questions in the audience, but I'm going to let Alex ask the first question, and then we're going to go into the and then we will go into the Q&A in the audience. So, Alex, go ahead.
Right. Well, first of all, thanks very much. I think it's an important message that you have, and coming from someone like you who's been in the business, and it is a business, of academia and academic administration, and uh, then on the national academic scene for quite some time. It's very important to
I don't like
hear.
to admit how long, so quite some time.
No numbers will be mentioned. Let's put it that way. Although if you were 20 feet from LBJ, that may give some indication.
It's true.
Um,
Yeah, that's a bit disclosing.
Something of a tell. Um,
Yeah, he yelled because there were a dozen of us, and we were chanting, LBJ, LBJ, and he said, "You fools, you fools," and that was because we were in a stadium at Ohio State, and there were like 50,000 farmers from the less than liberal Ohio countryside in the stadium, and when we began to chant, a ferocious animal growl of rage erupted from that stadium. And I think LBJ was worried that we'd be stamped to death.
Maybe not unreasonable, but um, okay. Well, here's what you've described, and you can tell me if I'm getting this wrong, is that in a sense, um, the modern university, the postmodern university, is a unification in a sense of postmodernism and revamped traditional anti-Semitism that's been de-Christianized, but that has shifted quite explicitly to um, red-green sorts of themes, communist Islamic themes, and that in a kind of paradoxical way, anti-Semitism, the absolutism about anti-Semitism, about the perfidiousness of Israel and by extension the Jews, um, is gives legitimation or license to um, infinite relativism, disciplinary, theoretical, conceptual relativism. So that strikes me as a kind of strange backward paradox, as well as the idea that Jews are the new Nazis who have to be excoriated in a quite Nazi-like fashion by the new absolutist Nazis who are eliminationist rather in a traditional sense. But my question, so here's my question though. Um, is all this a sign, all this from academia, from institutions? Is this a sign of success or is it a sign of failure? In the sense of, is this a leading indicator or a trailing indicator? Is this the last resort of a series of institutions and mechanisms that have palpably failed in the 21st century? Um, they don't do their job. They cost a lot of money. They produce ignorant uh, clients at the end? Or is it simply a sign of going from success to success? They've taken over and now they're expanding their message in all possible dimensions.
Well, because of its influence on the country, because it produces the professionals who go out and occupy important positions in the world, I think universities are, in that sense, a leading indicator of significant changes in the culture. In another sense, of course, in terms of their relationship to historic anti-Semitism, they're a follower. They're a place where ancient hatreds get reborn and rearticulated to new political and social demands. So I think it's both at the same time. Where I differ from you, and this will be hard to do in a condensed form, but I'm going to do it that way anyway, is with blaming postmodernism. Okay, I mean
The shorthand.
you're right. No, I'll do the shorthand version, even though that's always against my inclinations. I mean, you're talking to a confirmed post-structuralist, someone who believes that there are no intrinsic values. For me, one of the key lessons of the Holocaust, repeated on 10/7, is that people are capable of anything, that there is no inhumanity that human beings aren't fully capable of, that they have to be socialized and trained into something other. But there are no transcendent principles. So I'm a relativist to that degree. However, the fact that there are no guaranteed principles does not mean that we cannot choose to commit ourselves to principles, but they're a choice. They're a socially constructed option, and you make the option. You choose that it's not good to kill other people. You choose that it's not good to lie. You choose that it's not good to indoctrinate, and you promote that kind of value. But I don't believe there's anything intrinsic to the human species that makes those kind of choices more natural or more inevitable than others. And that seems to me the lesson, a key lesson from the Holocaust that we saw repeated in 10/7. Now of the key postmodernists and post-structuralist figures, including my favorite Jacques Derrida, the one who I was most loyal to over the years, he made many clear moral choices in his work. He decided that racism existed and was wrong and evil that should be combated. He wrote that nuclear war was a great danger and nuclear armament was a great danger and should be combated. Again, there were no guarantees that these things would be true, but he felt one could advocate for them. That's a relativism that places a much larger moral burden on you to act on behalf of the values you would like to see instilled in society.
Right. Alex, I'm going to go over to
Yeah,
the audience because we have a lot of
sure.
questions.
Thank you.
Try to get through some of that, but we can always come back. Thank you for that, Carrie. So, going to go to our our friend and colleague Ernie Sternberg, and so Ernie's going into a little bit of a brass tacks here and asking how would actually receivership of a department actually work in practice? Who could you appoint to do the sort of thing, given the hostility, and what? And he's also going on, what can be done with the faculty who will continue to be hostile and indoctrinate. He doesn't think there's a precedent for that, but if he wants a little bit more background on that, on the concept of receivership in general, and I guess obviously in particular now that this discussion is going on at Columbia.
Sure. Well, let me say, because I think that's an important topic. And greetings, Ernie. Always good to be talking with you. I believe the Mideast Studies program at Columbia belongs in receivership. I mean, I've been studying it for 30 years, and it's been bad all that time. It's an indoctrination center of the worst kind. I first wrote about Joseph Massad in about 2018, published the thing in my book in 2019. I mean, I've been aware of that enterprise for a long time, and it's an unacceptable one. However, I do not believe it is the job of the federal government to mandate receivership. I think that's a violation of academic freedom, and I think it's a form of fascism. The universities can't sustain their academic freedom and their independence if the federal government can basically say you have to close down an academic department. So what had to happen, and God knows what can happen now, is that Columbia had to reach itself the decision that that program had to be dealt with. Now, I would recommend as much public pressure and opprobrium placed on Columbia from alumni, from other faculty members, from legislators. I would hold Columbia's feet to the fire and give them no peace until they did something about that program. But I would not have the federal government exercise control over a university and demand that they do it. So point one. Point two, I think that the Trump administration did exactly the right thing in withdrawing funding to try to get Columbia to reform itself, because withdrawing funding is the only thing universities will listen to. I've been watching the Office of Civil Rights do very good investigative reports about anti-Semitism, and the universities all say, oh my God, this is serious. We're going to address this problem. And then they don't do a damn thing. They're not going to do anything unless you threaten them with a loss of funds. So that part of it I actually approve of, but some of the demands the Trump administration made, I think they have no business making. Now, how does a receivership work? Well, my favorite example of receivership is from that little-known campus, Harvard University. And it's a long time ago. It may be more than 40 years ago, when Harvard decided that its English department needed to be put into receivership. Not because they were politicizing or indoctrinating their students, but they decided that the tenured, if you can believe this, it's a wonderful story, that the tenured faculty in the English department were hiring second or third rate faculty members so that the tenured faculty would have no competition for students. They would hire people that students would disrespect, and the students would come to them for their dissertations, to enroll in their classes. And Harvard decided this needs to be fixed. So what they did, they took hiring and tenure decisions away from the English department, and they enrolled a committee nationally, not from their own campus, but a national committee to do Harvard to English department's hiring. So that's, in terms of Ernie's questions of what are you going to do with a campus that's already widely degraded? You find people elsewhere who are willing to do the job. Now, of course, Harvard, are you willing to serve on the committee for Harvard? And no matter where you are, you're flattered and you're happy to do it. You don't need to be paid. You're willing to donate to Harvard for the privilege. I mean, it was an easy thing for Harvard to do, but many schools, many of our large recognized, certainly R1 institutions that face this problem, could do receivership in the form of appointing international committees to handle hiring and tenure decisions. And they fixed, that worked for several years until Harvard did some good, English department did some good hiring and changed itself, and then the receivership was removed. So if it's not a fatal insult for Harvard to do it, then Columbia can do it. Then the University of Illinois can do it. It's perfectly workable. You don't have to rely on people on your own campus. But it's mainly hiring and personnel decisions. Now, it could get down to the level of curriculum. Part of it has to do with a decision about whether a given faculty member can teach a particular course. So once a department is in receivership, it could decide that Joseph Massad doesn't get to teach his course on Zionism, that he actually can't teach that course in a reasonable manner, that he teaches it in the form of indoctrination. And his teaching was investigated a long time ago and found to be problematic. So, this is not news. It's not news that he insults and humiliates his Zionist students. That's part of the record at Columbia. So you assign him a less problematic course. You assign him a subject where he doesn't bring his prejudices in so disruptively. Now, of course, he could still launch into lectures. You could have him do a course on drip agriculture, say, and he could still give you a lecture, an anti-Zionist lecture. But it would help matters if faculty members who do teach in an unethical way and an unprofessional way realized that they weren't guaranteed the right to do that they're in a department under receivership, and they can find themselves doing something else. In the worst case, with a tenured faculty member, you assign them to shelve books in the library rather than teach.
That would be a good use of Massad's time, but we can discuss that a little later. What else he should be doing? I'm going to try to combine a bunch of questions here. Some of the issues that have been brought up point with several questions, and this is maybe something if you want to comment on this, has to do with the impact of the same kind of poisonous indoctrination that we're also seeing impacting the K through 12, and your thoughts on again, what are the measures I'm adding here of a kind of transparency and accountability that we can influence there. In particular, it was mentioned here, some of the AB 101 with the California legislators that have now mandated poisonous curriculum in the public schools in K through 12, and again, more federal dollars. So we spoke about receivership, obviously, within higher education. Thoughts and ideas about K through 12.
Well, the world of K through 12 is radically different. When I was AEUP president, from time to time, I was asked to give talks about academic freedom to high school teachers and faculty. And I always began with the same statement. Well, we can talk about academic freedom, but you don't have any. There's no academic freedom for the K-12 faculty. The the case law record in the United States is very consistent, that gives the state a defining interest in what's taught K-12. So you have state intervention and state authority over the K-12 curriculum in a way that we don't have in higher education. And that means that the state's power can be used for good or ill in the K-12 scenario. And we're obviously seeing some of it used for ill in California. What's so terrible, or part of what's so terrible about anti-Zionist indoctrination at the K-12 level, is that many of these students are just too young to have independently developed political positions to be able to resist it. And so the power of indoctrination is much, much greater with a younger constituency. And the long-term damage done when young people are indoctrinated, the damage to the country, the damage to their lives and their freedom of thought thereafter, is just huge. But if you can't get the legislature, which has this power over the curriculum, to reform it, if in fact the legislature is part of the problem, not part of the solution, and it obviously is in Florida, it is in California, it's not just one place where the legislature is not a source of light and truth, then it's going to take huge public intervention to try to get the situation changed. I don't do any activism in K-12. It's my activism is mostly all for higher education, but I think parents need to get involved because the destructive effect is really greater than it is in higher education.
Great, thank you. Let me just try to go, see here. What else? So one more question, another question here that is asked by Heidi Wald is asking really, we've spoken about obviously a lot about what's going on in the humanities. With everything that's going on, this kind of moving over to the STEM areas, in particular, the medical schools that we're seeing are now an outrage of anti-Semitism in the residency programs, the medical schools. Any thoughts about, the indoctrination there as far as what can be done, different between, I'm adding here, between contrasting between the humanities and the STEM areas as far as some kind of accountability and transparency in the way that the poisonous indoctrination takes place in those spaces?
Well, once again, I've been surprised, and I did not see the likely anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic drift in the medical sciences. I mean, I thought never there. For one thing, when I grew up, a lot of doctors were Jews, and you just didn't expect it. The medical profession is much more diversified, which is a good thing, than it was 200 years ago when I was a kid. But there's been quite a lot of writing in the last 6 to 9 months documenting anti-Zionist indoctrination, anti-Zionist cruelty toward medical students and staff in a number of places in the country. So that, and other people are beginning to fight it. And if it's happening there, I think the medical sciences are the canary in the STEM coal mine. That's a new phrase as of this moment that you can credit to your event. If it's happening in medical sciences, it will spread to other STEM fields. So the time for those fields to reassert themselves and make that impossible, I think, is now. It can't wait much longer. A lot of medical sciences have a high degree of independence on campus, but the problem in any program that shifts toward anti-Zionist indoctrination and cruelty toward its students points to one thing that's universal, which is that in higher education, all departments are responsible for one another. The way that disciplines have been siloed increasingly over the last half century, it's a multi-decades long process, means that they don't interfere with one another, that they don't take any responsibility for one another. The president of Princeton did a piece in the Chronicle of Higher Education just a couple of days ago, responding to the Trump administration's initiative toward Columbia that basically said, you can't blame the chemistry department for what happens in women's studies or Mideast studies. It's not the chemistry department's fault. This is like guilt by association. So if you withdraw 400 million in funding from Columbia, you're punishing departments for whom anti-Zionism is not an issue on the basis of those departments where it is. Well, guess what? Unless we all take responsibility for one another's teaching and one another's political distortion of the curriculum, unless chemistry does take responsibility for Mideast studies, then we're not going to get out of this problem, because Mideast studies ain't going to reform itself. There was a long-standing AAUP fantasy. I believed it. And the fantasy was, first, yes, we acknowledge the departments and disciplines, entire disciplines, can go off the rails. They can become politicized in destructive ways. But there are built-in mechanisms whereby disciplines will come to their senses. Women's studies will come to its senses. Mideast studies will come to its senses in time. Well, my only response to that is that the evolution of planet Earth does not provide the time frame in which those disciplines will come to their senses. I no longer believe they are capable of reforming themselves. They ain't going to do it. Certainly not while the three of us are alive on this earth. It ain't going to happen in that time frame. Sure, 1.5 million years from now, I won't predict. But it's only going to get fixed if the academic community takes mutual responsibility for its members and its academic components. That's nothing else is going to fix the problem. And I'm sorry, it means, the physicists need to spend some time outside their labs or their theoretical speculations on the computer. There are programs that law colleges need to do more work regarding other disciplines on campus, in addition to their own anti-Semitic movements. Business colleges need to take more responsibility for the rest of campus, because what we believed in the AAUP was not true, or at least maybe it seemed true at the time, but it's not true any longer. The reform of academic disciplines, Mideast studies is not going to say, we've been thinking about what we do, and I think we belong in receivership, right? They're not going to declare themselves intellectually and philosophically bankrupt. The rest of us have to do it.
Great. Carrie, that's a good point to, unfortunately our time is up. It's a good place to end, but I think we all agree on that point as far as, who's, they're not going to reform themselves, and debunking the fantasy of the utopia of what can and can't happen is obviously critical as far as, the first line is identifying the problem as far as a way to solve it. So, I think that, obviously describe the problem that we're all living in, as best as anybody can. And I think that's it's critical for us to understand what we're facing today, and what are actual deliverables and what can actually take place. So I really want to thank you again for taking the time to talk to us. You are a very strong and important voice, and we're happy to to be together on this team as far as we try to deal with all these growing challenges.
Well, on screen are three strong voices, so it's good to be amongst them.
Well, that's good. We're stronger in numbers. As always, I want to thank my colleague and friend Alex for joining me. I want to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon. There were many other questions, and I apologize for not getting to them. We will do our best to respond after the webinar. Carrie, I hope you can come back and share with us more insights along the way at a later date. And we hope to see everybody soon in our next webinar.
Anytime, you know where I live.
All good. Take care, everybody. Have a
Thanks
good
very
day.
much, Gary.
Thank you.
Be well.